Okay, hello again. Um, this time we're talking about political parties. I'm just going to dive right in, hoping to keep this shorter than I've been able to in semesters and years past. Um, Obviously, two major parties in this country. That'll be a theme. We usually identify them alongside with the most prominent leader figure of the two parties. So, for better for worse, for recent years, it's been the guy on the left here, Donald Trump, as the face of the Republican Party, and the masked face below on the left of the lower picture, Joe Biden, the current president. Um, but yeah, as you can hear in my voice, I'm about as thrilled to talking about these two individuals as many people are to talk about political parties. But anyway, it is the reality. We'll talk about how and why we're so in love with two political parties in practice a bit later in the slides. But before we do that, want to think big picture here about what are political parties, right? Um, the biggest difference between a political party and any other activist group of any kind is that political parties seek to put their members in office, right? So they attempt to influence government by electing their members to office, as I say here, right? The electing in italics, right? That's what makes a party a party, and that's what separates a party from any sort of politically mindful activist group, right? The constitutional system we have of federalism and checks and balances and the separation of powers and bicameralism and such makes it very difficult for one party to gain complete control of the government in the United States, which generally I think is a pretty good thing in some ways. It helps keep the tyranny of the majority in check. Right. But as Lowy says here, parties still are critical in making elections and government work. Um, that's pretty established wisdom in political science. So um, sometimes I want to quibble with such a statement like that parties are critical in making elections and government work. Um, but I often say if parties were so critical, and if the founding fathers were so wise, why aren't parties mentioned at all in the Constitution? Right? That's something just to keep in your back pocket, keep in the back of your mind. For our obsession with the two party system that we have, the two parties that we have in general, these are not institutions created by the Constitution. Quite the contrary, right? The Constitution does not mention parties at all. But anyway, to engage in politics, parties are pretty necessary. Here's some of the things they do. They recruit candidates, right? The candidates don't come out of nowhere. I mean, sometimes they do. I don't know, thinking about a recent president. But parties, one of the most basic things that both parties do, or any party does, is to find, quality folks to run for office up and down the ballot, federal, state, local elections. And that's not always easy. People don't want to run. The wrong people want to run. Running for office is quite difficult. Holding office is quite difficult. I don't know how anybody does stuff like that and has a family at the same time. I'm new to the having a family thing relatively, and I don't know how people have the time. But I'm increasingly impressed by certain politicians who are able to seemingly keep their families together and do stuff. But parties try to find good candidates who can raise or have the necessary money, who can appeal and who can appeal to the public, which is often harder to do. The nomination process is that by which parties select their candidates to run for office. Traditionally, this was done behind closed doors in the proverbial smoke filled rooms among party leaders to basically just choose who the nominees would be. That's not really the case anymore in the United States, which I think we can agree is a relatively good thing. However, I think we've seen examples of national primaries in recent cycles in which registered voters in primaries don't always perhaps make the wisest of decisions. And I'm thinking of both parties at this moment in time. But anyway, conventions tend to choose insiders while parties leave a door more widely open for outsiders to sneak in. We could talk about European parliamentary systems that don't really have primaries, that make it more difficult for wild cards to rise through the ranks. As much as I don't like sometimes who wins primaries in the United States or primary systems wherever they're held, I guess I prefer that to party elites making choices for everyone else. But maybe we can talk about that when we reconvene in the 50-minute section. Maybe I'll run that by you all. Types of primaries. We can talk of closed or open primaries. In a closed primary, and this is why, and this came up last week in last week's discussions in most of my sections. If you're registered to vote and you're registered with a party, if the state you're registered to vote in, and I don't know how it works in California off the top of my head, as I've never registered to vote in California, but you can only vote in a primary for the party that you're registered with, right? In an open primary, some states, I think Minnesota is one of these, that will allow you to choose which party's primary you participate in on the day of. Closed primaries are definitely preferred by party organizers because it allows them to better anticipate what the result will be. In an open primary, you sometimes get people changing party affiliations to go in and perhaps vote for the person in the party they oppose. They might go vote for the least palatable candidate, hoping that person, if victorious in the primary, would be easiest to defeat in the general election against the party that the person who switched parties to vote would want to win, right? So that's how that works. If that's not clear, I'm going to try to not talk in circles to keep my lecture here a little shorter than I've done recently. So we'll move on. But if you have questions about this, ask me when it comes up, or when we get together for the 50-minute bisynchronous session. More function of parties, Game of Thrones V. Oh, no, sorry. Getting out the vote. GOTV. That's what that means. Parties' role in getting out the vote. Parties used to be indispensable in this process. I think now in the 21st century age of the anti-social media and such, there are other entities that do this. But parties work to register voters. They work to persuade eligible voters to vote. They likely, of course, try to persuade eligible voters to vote for what they want, right? Parties, generally speaking, seek to do these general things. But once you get past registration and just encouraging people to vote, period, parties definitely, want us to vote a certain way. Parties used to perform these functions by themselves, but today, again, as I mentioned a minute ago, 21st century, lots of other organizations, candidate organizations, outside organizations, et cetera, have significant get out the vote operations. Should not surprise us. Functions of parties, again, also facilitating electoral choice. Voters tend not to know much about the candidates for the offices up and down the ballot, especially down ballot candidates. I even said, in the last session that we were together, I pulled up my ballot from when I would vote electronically back in Kansas, and I said flat out, even having a PhD, I never know who's all the names on the ballot in any of the states I've ever voted in. And that's kind of sad, but I mean, I'm being honest with you folks. You have to have more than a PhD in political science to know all the names on most every ballot. So even folks like me turn to party affiliation to make decisions, perhaps based on nothing but blind faith or a hunch. But it's really, as I say here, a brand name that help voters who know nothing about a candidate to make a semi-informed choice. Sometimes it boils down to voting for an R or a D. I wish that weren't the case, but again, I'm willing to own up to the fact that I've done it. So don't be ashamed. Excuse me, I got a bit of a hiccup. Continuing on, parties. We can thank parties for the rise of presidential debates. My apologies here. I'm fighting up fighting hiccups. I got a hyperlink here that I believe just talks about the generalities of presidential debates. And they started, I want to say, during the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon campaign. And yeah, the link here will explain this a bit. Nixon didn't prepare, didn't want to wear makeup, et cetera, and he came off as sort of a sweaty weirdo against very photogenic and much younger and much make-upped and much prepped John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. But the presidential debates do, I think, help us. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, we tended to tune in more attentively than the 21st century, where you can just kind of catch the highlights the next day, maybe. But they are a good means of helping us to make decisions, particularly in presidential elections. Arguably the most informed decision up and down the ballot that one makes. And really, the person at the top can be really important, particularly in presidential election years, as that tends to lead us, when we aren't completely informed of what's, entirely on the ballot. In presidential election years, if we know we're going to vote for the R or for the D, that might really lead us to tick the boxes for other R's and D's down the ballot. That's called riding the coattails of the presidential nominee. But if we don't like the person at the top, then flip the coin. It can work the other way. Some of us go in and vote more against somebody than for somebody else, right? But I've got a couple of other links here. The initial one here, the person at the top is the most important, takes you to, I think, a recap of the 2012 presidential debate, the first one between Obama and then presidential nominee, Republican nominee Mitt Romney. And Obama blew it. I watched it live. I was living in Minnesota at the time, and it was a bit of a massacre. And I'll show you some data in a second to back that up. And then I've got another addendum link in the module slides that talks about a debate between Trump and Biden in 2020. And my father, a lifelong Republican, mind you, stormed out of the room because he couldn't take listening to Trump anymore. So again, the person at the top is pretty important in any electoral cycle. The person at the top of the ballot, I mean to say. So that first debate between Obama and Romney took place in Denver, the Sunshine State. That's a joke. In October of 2012. And you can see that immediately, a week later, I guess, Obama really took a hit in the polls. The performance was so bad that it gave Romney a temporary lead. We know that Obama ended up winning re-election in 2012, but these things aren't always set in stone, is what I'm saying here. Parties with as brand names, I completely agree with this. I've taught this course at Humboldt off and on, mostly on, but going back to like 2017 or 18. And as many times as I've used different editions of this Lowy book, I never knew who this Lloyd Doggett guy was. Turns out he's still a member of Congress, and his gerrymandered district, he's a Democrat, as you can see here. So his district, very gerrymandered by Texas Republicans, is a sliver from Austin to San Antonio. His district is miles away from where I live. Never knew that. But if I saw his name on the ballot, maybe just knowing that he's a Democrat, it might have been somebody who I'd have voted for, depending on, if I'd lived a little bit to the east of where I live now. But brand names can be pretty important. Sometimes it's the only thing we have to really make our decisions based upon, right? Other functions of parties, obviously they seek to influence government. Before elections, they build up coalitions among aligned interests. They develop policy platforms right before an election, particularly presidential elections. Either the major parties have policy platforms in which they say, here's what we're after, here's what we're aiming for. Democrats tend to push for greater government intervention in the economy, less social regulation, expansion of civil rights. Republicans, as the conservative party, tend to favor more laissez-faire, hands-off economics, right? The free market, the invisible hand, blah, 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 and greater social regulation. These are just general concepts, right? The general concepts we associate with the two major parties. But come election time, the policy party platforms tend to be much more specific and very detailed if you look on a website, on the party websites. Parties organize government as well in practice. And again, this is not in the Constitution, worth reminding ourselves. And this isn't always done along party lines. In the age of great polarization, it tends to be that way. But we could look at the healthcare reform of 2010, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it. This hyperlink, I think, takes you to a John Oliver segment on healthcare reform. But there were some Republicans that got on board and voted in favor of the Affordable Care Act at the time. We could also think to October of 2023, in which one party, the Republicans, very much disorganized the House of Representatives. And within their own party in the House, took 3 weeks to sort out the defenestration, the removal of the previous Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, and the naming and appointment, nomination and appointment of the new guy, Mike Johnson, I think is his name, from Louisiana. So again, parties are meant to provide organization within a functioning government, but they don't always work along party lines. Not trying to get into stereotypes here, but the text does explain a little bit of patterns we can find with group affiliations with parties in the United States. Democrats, Republicans, obviously you can see here 2 columns. It's not that there aren't wealthy rural residing folks who are business people and white and Protestant with graduate degrees and who are male who aren't Republican, or who sorry, how did I phrase that? It's not that there aren't wealthy rural business folks who are white, Protestant with postgraduate degrees and who are men who are not Republicans, but it tends to be that these variables, when they accumulate, lead us to assume, yeah, this person's probably a Republican, right? It's not that there aren't poor urban union members who are Black or Jewish, Latino, et cetera, women, et cetera, who are Republicans. They do exist, but generally speaking, we see these characteristics on one side or the other tend to line up with one party or another. And the more you accumulate of these as well, the more you can start to anticipate, what someone's party affiliation would be, right? That's not dissimilar to the United States. Democrats in California tend to be more ethnically diverse, tend to be less wealthy, younger, more female, etc. Right? I mean, this again should not surprise us. Democrats in California, more broadly in the United States, tend to hold more liberal views on these things you see here. Republicans in California, 3 out of 4 are pretty conservative. I think I've made the point in past class sessions, in a few sections at least, that I think I tend to find some Republicans in California way more conservative, and rabidly so, than sort of your average conservative Republican in my home state of Kansas. And I tend to see Democrats in my home state of Kansas to be a little more liberal, a little more engaged, a little more aware of what's going on, because they're not just going with the flow, right? So, I mean, it's worth stressing. I'm going to come back to this point too. Please don't make assumptions that any one person, one way or another, is of one party or another, or that their party affiliation can't change. But especially when we look at group identification or party identification by social group, is when it's easier to start seeing patterns, right? Because when they accumulate, we're in effect taking into consideration the outliers in our analysis here. But you can see the gender gap, which has come up in previous chapters as well. Party identification by gender. Women tend to be more overwhelmingly Democratic than Republican, or Democrats than Republicans. The older you get, the more conservative you tend to be. Again, it's not to say there aren't young people who are conservative. They exist. It's not to say there aren't old people who are liberal. They exist. But again, when you start adding these variables up, you start to see how patterns evolve. You look at race and ethnicity here. I don't think I need to explain much. Education as well. Generally speaking, Republicans, well, it's hard to say this stage. I think this is part of the Trump effect as well. We're starting to see people with less and less education move further to the right. Again, it's not everyone. And if you look at education here, by education, it's really actually that's what's the most evenly distributed. So surprise, surprise. Maybe this is something to somebody will do a dissertation on this in the coming years and decades. Wealth can also be a variable. Middle class folks tend to middle class and the wealthier you get tend to be a little more conservative. But again, it's not a hard and fast rule. Again, what I'm saying here is, feel free to look for patterns, but understand that you shouldn't make assumptions about any one person in particular. This is from the Katz-Nelson text, so you didn't have to read this chapter, but I left this in the slides because it is worth seeing assumptions you can make here. If we look at political participation by income group, right? And this is in quintiles, so broken down, and this is a little dated. It's from 1990, this data, but I think it probably still holds true today. And logically, think of it this way: lowest 5th%, poorest 5th% of the country makes up 14% of the vote. The highest 5th% makes up 26%, which is to say, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to vote. The less wealthy you are, the less likely you are to vote. This would help us to explain why the interests of the wealthier are better represented, perhaps, in Congress. Ideally, this would be 2020, 2020, right? It would be very evenly distributed. But the fact, again, that the wealthier you are, the more likely it is that you vote, often because it's easier for you to do so for reasons we've already discussed. But that's what throws these numbers out of whack. If you look at who can, participate in the political system by hours of time, surprise, surprise as well, the poor among us, the lowest 60%, the least wealthy of us, 60% of us, that is, only do less than 50% of the time dedicated to political participation, and that's probably because poorer people don't have as much leisure time to volunteer their time. And you might say, well, wealthy people have to work really hard too. And that's true. My dad ended up pretty wealthy and works pretty hard still into his 70s. But for about half of his life and most of his married life, my mom didn't have to work and she did volunteer. She didn't volunteer politically for things my dad would agree with, but that's beside the point. My point is, the wealthier a family is, the more likely it is that someone within that family is able to dedicate time to political endeavors. And obviously, then when it comes to financial donations for political ends, the lowest 20% of us within this country give under 1% of the total dollars donated to political causes, right? Again, this is 1990. If anything, I'm sure these numbers are further out of whack. Anyway, that's all I'll say about that. I think if I try to keep talking, I'm just going to repeat myself. But you can see how wealth can very much influence how you participate in the political system. And it probably has a lot to do with how political parties will react to you, right? Shifting gears a bit, and I've said this a time or two this semester, professors of political science love to talk about abortion. I'm kidding. But it's very easy, I think, for us to understand how party coalitions into the 2020s now, into the 21st century here, given that Roe's been overturned, I think we've really entrenched ourselves regarding this topic very much along political lines, right? If you're driven to vote because of the issue of abortion, you tell me where you stand on that issue, and I will safely assume how you vote, right? In that case, when you get specific like that, I bet there are very, very few folks who are very much pro-choice, but vote for the Republican Party generally for whatever reason. I doubt that is the case. It could happen. There might be those people out there, but I doubt that's the case. I've alluded to and said I'd come back to it, but I do want to take another second here to stress that the basis of political parties can change over time. Parties do evolve over time. The Republican Party was not always the way it is right now. Neither was the Democratic Party. California was not always this progressive state. For the better part of the middle of the 20th century, it was very conservative. Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, very conservative presidents. Both, what do they have in common other than being Republican presidents of the United States? They would both prior been Republican governors of the state of California, right? But we can see that over time, going back to the 50s and into the 2000s, the National Democratic Party has diversified quite a bit, right? We see fewer white Christians in the party. We see fewer white Christians making up the Republican Party as well, but still make up a much higher percentage. And as the white Christian population has declined in both parties, minorities and non-Christian whites have made up the balance, right, to add up to 100. But point is, again, that parties evolve over time. Worth mentioning as well, thank you, Van Vechten. I like these maps in her book. Sometimes you can see, looking at party registration, California, particularly in the interior, right, to the east, and I have to stress this to students sometimes, is pretty conservative, right? I mean, I don't know if any of you are from Reading, but it ain't a progressive place. I've only stopped a couple of times, but it definitely did not give off the California vibe that I expected it to give as I drove there the first time as I drove to Arcata in August of 2016. It's just that you have a lot more people, right? Much more population along the coast in these counties where you find predominant numbers of registered Democrats. And if you look at the goofy map here, this balloons things out according to size of population. So that's what explains that there. So you can see that the counties with larger Democratic registered voters have more people. Put it that way. Parties and institutions here. Again, parties are pretty important, especially come election time or in the run up to presidential elections. I've mentioned in class how in 1988, I was 10 years old and I insisted on staying away from a Little League game so I could watch the Republican National Convention because the senator from my home state of Kansas, Bob Dole, now deceased, spoke at that convention as he had run for the nomination. But that's where we see presidential candidates confirm their nomination, and that's often where we see the party platform released, published, presented, etc. The National Party Committee is an institution, a machine that runs year-round, 24/7, doesn't matter the cycle, seeking to raise money and better the party's image or brand name. You often see the losing party after a presidential election do some introspection. In recent cycles, that hasn't led to much, as you can imagine. There are congressional campaign committees that there's one in the Senate and one in the House. These also pretty much operate year round, especially in the House, as the terms are shorter, so there's more turnover of candidates, a constant need to raise money as everyone in the House is up for re-election every 2 years. And then they provide services, to candidates. The state and local organizations, right? Both parties, I'm sure, they have operations in every state. And it kind of varies from state to state, depending on how red or blue it is, how active the minority party is in that state. And that has a trickle-down effect to local organizations, very progressive, in progressive towns, in progressive states. I doubt you would see a very active local Republican Party, although the Republican Party of Humboldt County used to have its office on that 101 Main Drag in Eureka, across the street from a barbecue place that I don't know if it's still there, but that did Kansas City style barbecue. Highly recommended. But the state and local parties is also where you see greater movement to register voters, recruit candidates, and also raise small donor money. So it's not to say that state and local organizations aren't important, even in states where the party is the minority. Some people in my field have been critical of the Democratic Party in Florida in particular for basically just letting the Republicans take it over. But I think this is Lee County, Virginia here. And Virginia would be a good example of a state, officially a southern state, right? That for the longest time was, well, for the back end of the 20th century and into the 21st, pretty Republican. But because Virginia, Northern Virginia, is basically just suburban Washington, D.C., and a lot of people who live and work in or work in D.C. but live in Virginia tend to be more progressive or left of center, left leaning. The Democrats have come to take over at the state level Virginia. I'm sure the local Republican Party is still quite influential in certain, southern, more inland parts of Virginia. But again, and I will come back to this point again, I will remind you, party affiliation, party identity, as we link it to places, evolves over time. It doesn't always stay the same. But anyway, continuing. Other things parties do, they provide candidate service. They're candidate service providers. They provide services to candidate organizations, obviously raising money. Parties can provide voter lists. That's very important to know for a campaign. Who to target, who's going to be receptive, who won't be. Then obviously to the Game of Thrones, get out the vote to do that. National parties provide campaign advice. They coordinate expenditures, et cetera, et cetera. And then sometimes nowadays do this almost in parallel to a candidate's own organization, assuming that candidate is big enough to have their own you know campaign team that would work in tandem with the party team. But sometimes the party has more say in this, and sometimes the candidate has a little more autonomy. And that usually happens when the higher up you go, maybe like for Senate campaigns and such in the House. But it kind of boils down to how influential the candidate himself, herself, themselves is. Parties supplement and support candidate campaigns, right? There we go. That's kind of the point I was trying to make about the parallel form of campaigning. Thinking about the party system, a party system, a broad definition here is a equilibrium in which two or more parties compete with stable coalitions for a period of time. I'll superficially talk about this in a minute here, but our political system, our party system, has evolved in a way that we really only have two. There are more parties. I don't mean to poo-poo any other party, ideologically at all. They have a right to exist. I personally wish there were more than two effective parties in the states, but that's the term I often use. We really only have two effective parties, and that's a consequence of our winner-take-all elections. Some particularly southern states do hold runoffs. Like if someone doesn't get 50% plus one of the votes, they'll go to a runoff election. But that's rare. Most elections in the United States are winner-take-all, which means you don't need a majority of the votes. You just need the most votes out of 2, 3, however many candidates, right? So, when the few times there's been a third party candidate running for president, the last time effectively was 1996, who got, like hundreds of thousands, millions of votes around the country. And the same guy ran in 92 and 96. His name was Ross Perot. And so thus you had Bill Clinton win in 92 and 96, never winning more than 40% of the vote, right? So, which goes to show, it illustrates the point that third parties might make a splash, but, they really don't, they're not strong enough to suck the oxygen away from the other two parties. And then as Lowy says, and I stick to the text and I say my own thing sometimes, but Lowy makes the claim that there's really no ideological room for more than two parties. I can't agree with that. I can disagree with that. Some people say, well, I really wish there was a centrist party, but in the grand scheme of things, when you zoom out from the Republicans and the Democrats in practice, you think about democracy really broadly, you start to see that there's not that much distance between these two parties. The Democrats are not nearly as progressive as a lot of progressives think that they are, wish the Democrats would be. The Democrats are also not as socialist and communist as many Republicans throw out the term and label them. And the same goes, a lot of Republicans, aren't as off the charts Republican as the ones who get the most attention in the media, and on all forms of media, by the way. In the grand scheme of things, the ideological center of both parties is really not that far away. So, if anything, I think we might need to see. It might be helpful to see parties, one to the left of the Democrats, one to the right of the Republicans, and then we can talk, about how that would play out. But it is worth reminding ourselves too, and I'm going to stop there because if not, I'm just going to keep rambling on in circles about my musings on third parties. But realignments punctuate the movements between party systems. In the United, what do I mean by that? In the United States, there's not always been a Republican and a Democratic Party. I'm going to whiz over this history. Sometimes I get too bogged down in this. I'm not going to ask you, much less an essay question about this, so don't feel like you need to know this. All I want to do is walk you through the party systems very quickly to just illustrate the point that the die is not cast. 40 years from now, 30 years from now, 20 years from now, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party might look a lot different than they do now. The Republican Party, I can tell you, right now in the 2020s looks way different than it did 20, 25 years ago when I was trying to figure out, how do I identify with one of these parties or the other? But anyway, the first party system gets back to the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists by another name. We talked about that earlier in the semester. The Federalists favored a stronger central government, a stronger federal government, right? And the Democratic Republicans, which, how confusing is that for a name, led by Jefferson, James Madison, tended to be Southerners and more in favor of states' rights, as they say. And this system disappeared after the War of 1812. So it didn't take too long for this system to dissipate. The Democrats took over for the Democratic Republicans. The Whigs came out of nowhere to sort of replace the space occupied by the Federalists. The Democrats then, stronger in the South and the West, really didn't have a lot to do intellectually, ideologically with the Democrats today. So this is, again, why I'm just going to keep moving through this. We get a third party system by 1860, and this is right the cusp of the Civil War. The Republicans are formed. The Democrats continued. The Republicans, led by Abraham Lincoln, Republicans today love to tell you that. But this was also the party of the northern states and in the cities against enslavement, et cetera, more in favor of federal power and commercial interests. Which kind of sounds, you say northern states, cities, federal power, you think, oh, that sounds like the Democrats today. Oh, commercial interests, maybe less so. Just again, goes to show parties evolve. They're in a constant state of flux. Don't ever assume that they are static, right? Democrats, back to the time of the Civil War, strong in the South and the Midwest, supporting rural interests. I'll let you in on a secret. These Democrats eventually, by about 60 years later, after 1896, into the 1960s. Sorry, about 100 years after this system was set up, these Democrats in effect become Republicans. Let's see, what do I have here? Fourth party system. Some overlap here. Early 1900s. Again, I think I'm just going to skip this here because I'm not a historian in this. Where things do start to get more relatable to the present day. And we've talked about this, the importance of FDR's presidency and the Great Depression, World War II, etc. The fifth party system is characterized by what we call the New Deal coalition. The Democratic Party really ballooned. You got some very successful presidents, if you will, FDR, Truman, Eisenhower came next, then JFK, then LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And as the Democratic Party grew during this time, you saw it incorporate, this gets back to the growth of, the diversification of the Democratic Party. You see Democrats pick up particularly African Americans in the South, Union members, Catholics, Jews, etc. The Republicans, during this period, most prominent Republican at the time, Texas-born, Kansas-raised, Dwight D. Eisenhower, World War II general, a Republican, by today's standards, a Republican in name only. You'll see in a later film that we'll watch, the highest tax rate under Eisenhower was like 91%. Ask a Republican today if they'd be okay with that. But Eisenhower, I think, just had a different understanding of government than his contemporary Republicans do today. But Republicans were still big in New England and the Midwest, which, surprise, surprise, isn't where we, not the regions we most identify with Republicans. They, particularly New England, at least. The Midwest is kind of a coin flip, but there you go. By present day, we get what many are calling a sixth party system. This has a lot to do with the history of the hyperlink you'll see here. This takes you to a Vox story about the evolution of the party system. It will particularly explain how Richard Nixon, again, California conservative, basically turned the South, which had been Democratic and still pretty racist and supremacist and whatnot, but turned them Republican, right? So all the stereotypes that you young folks have today about Southerners and whatever baggage you might have in your head, and I'm sure that includes the Republican Party, I will tell you, these same folks, the same cultural space was overwhelmingly Democratic until the 1960s. Okay. But during the 1960s, you saw Catholics and a lot of religious conservatives move to the right, which is to say, to identify with the Republican Party. Both parties since the 1960s, have become more ideologically homogenous, which is to say more uniform collectively, one way or the other, and simultaneously more even matched in federal elections. Which has been kind of frustrating to watch, says your political science friend here, Larson. This just gives you a visual here. I'm not going to say anything about this in particular, but you can see the evolution of, when the Democrats came about, when the Republicans came about. There was a Prohibition Party. Glad that one disappeared. A Socialist Party, which existed in the early 1900s until the 1920s. This is after the Russian Revolution, when it became bad to be anything associated with socialists or communists, etc. But the Republicans and Democrats have survived for quite some time. I do wonder if the Republican Party today in the 2020s is on the verge of some sort of major shift. I don't know. I mean, we've seen in October of 23 the kerfuffle, to put it very lightly, that the Republicans have undergone in naming a Speaker of the House. I mentioned that a little bit ago. I don't know what the future holds for the Republican Party as it stands. That's not to say that the Democrats obviously have their act together collectively, but the disarray is more obvious right now in one party over the other. The guy here on the right is a guy named George Wallace, had been a Democrat, and he saw the South change in front of him, shift from Democrats to Republican. And he ran for president, I want to say in 1948, as an independent, third party independent. And the last person to run as an overt segregationist. And he refused to run as a Democrat, and he refused to run as a Republican. Had been the governor of Alabama. I don't know if I had said that, but a gem of a human, I'm sure. But indicative of fissures within the Republican Party at the time. And I wonder if we're seeing more of that in the 2020s now, especially with what we've seen in the House of Representatives, as Kevin McCarthy was thrown out as the House Speaker in early October of 2023, and it took 3 weeks to name a successor, who's someone hardly anyone's ever heard of, by the way. Here you see from the Lowy text here, the evolution of U.S. party identification from 1940 to 2022. You can see that, if anything, the number of us registered as independents has been on the rise. The number of us registered as Democrats has definitely decreased since the age of Kennedy. That might have a lot to do with just the draw of the person. I don't know. Speaking of, you saw a bit of a tick up as Obama came onto the scene, but generally speaking, most of us are independents, and then it's kind of a relatively even split. It's about a third of us are Republicans, about a third are Democrats, about a third and change, a little more independent, and there it is. The difference in the election, the electoral process is Republicans, registered Republicans, are more reliable voters, which is to say they go out and vote They miss fewer elections. I'll put it that way. But parties and candidates looking at 2020, you can see that the percentage of the popular vote here, which we know can sometimes mean crap, but Joe Biden won 51%, and ironically won in the Electoral College by the same tally as Trump had beaten Hillary Clinton 4 years earlier in 2016, 302 to something or other. I forget what it is. I can't do that kind of math on the fly. But there we go. This is from an earlier edition of the Lowy text. I just left this in because it's a better layout than the newer edition, but I just leave this here so you can see. I'm not going to focus on anything over time, I don't think. I don't like how this is ordered, but you can see how the electoral votes evolve over time. This is, which party won the state. Most important to look at the red and this sort of teal, blue for the Democrats. But you can see, there have been elections, 1980, where Ronald Reagan pretty much just cleaned the floor, in 84 again with everybody, and pretty much the whole country was almost Republican. Whereas in 1936, again, this is FDR's time, pretty much everybody voted for the Democrats. And if we go and look at like 1952, jump to 1956, you can see Democrats controlled these southern states, and then after that is where we start to see the effect of the Nixon southern strategy to turn the South quite conservative. The reason the South was more liberal in 76 had to do with Jimmy Carter as the candidate. He was much more, he was a Southern former governor of Georgia, and I think made some Southerners recalibrate their vote. But really, since then, the Republicans have controlled the South, as we know. Shifting back to California, and I'm almost done. I've gone a little longer than I wanted, but still shorter than I have in weeks past. California is a Democratic stronghold, but weakly partisan. And that's kind of my point that I was making a minute ago. I think, in states that so strongly identify one way or another, if you identify with the political majority, you tend to be more weakly partisan. You're less engaged. You're less informed. You're a little more just go with the flow, right? And that happens when Democrats dominate the legislative and executive branches of your state, which is the case in California. More people are registered as Democrats than any other party, but it's less than an absolute majority. There are more registered Democrats than independents, which does not coincide with the national trend. Only 28% of Californians, give or take, are registered Republicans. Many would prefer not to register with a party. And I will say this: I bet of that 28% who are registered Republicans, they tend to be quite more active in the party and more informed. Well, it's a relative term, but informed, convinced of their leanings, we'll put it that way, than others, than conservatives in states where the conservatives are the majority. Put it that way, to reiterate my point. This just maps it out here. Party registration in 2015. No party preference is about a quarter. There you go. A few words to say about third parties. Again, it's really hard for them to gain traction in the U.S. system. I didn't say earlier, but I'll add now. Things like with the presidential debates, it's the Republicans and the Democratic parties that organize the debates, and there's a vested interest in both of the two major parties and not allowing anybody else on the stage, right? I mean, think about it this way. If you're in a competition and you have one adversary and you're pretty evenly matched, would you want to invite others to compete or not? I mean, if you're at a golf tournament, you're one golfer of 100, or you're one golfer of 2. No matter how much better the other golfer is than you, you've got a better shot at winning if there are just 2 of you playing, right? So, think about it that way. There are a lot of reasons why third parties don't exist. Again, no ideological room for third parties is, again, a debate, a statement I would quibble with. The fact is, there are fewer and fewer conservative Democrats or liberal Republicans. That's true. And maybe, I guess, if we do polarize ourselves so much and the parties do move further left and further right, maybe there would open some space in the middle for some centrist party. But again, I don't know how that would work out in practice, and I don't want to hypothesize on your time right now. But there are a lot of systemic and structural advantages for the two-member parties. Single member districts in the House with the winner take all votes, where you don't have to have a majority of the votes, you just have to have more votes than anybody else. That tends to disincentivize third parties from even participating, right? Because you don't want to get into a fight that you know you're going to lose as well. Kudos to those who do. I don't think I have the patience, much less the money to do that. Existing party identification is very strong. I mean, if, let's say, hypothetically, the Democrats just disappeared tomorrow, I don't, it would take some time for whatever party would fill that vacuum to create the brand name, the term we used earlier, to fill the void, right? And I say here, name ruined after Netflix docuseries debut. This joke is increasingly dated, but if you watch this third party's link above, it takes you to a hilarious segment from 2016, before the presidential elections, from John Oliver, where he just takes down the Libertarian candidate and the Green Party candidate, and also introduces us to a guy named Joe Exotic, the what do you call him, the Cheetah King, the Lion King, the Tiger King, sorry, the Tiger King. Yeah, he had run as a third party candidate officially for president in like 2012 or something like that. Which I'm sure if you saw the Tiger King show during the pandemic, you knew this already. I did not watch the Leopard King show. I had no patience for it because I had seen Joe Exotic in this clip and knew to stay away from him. But anyway, beside the point, that's my attempt at an increasingly dated joke. As I wrap up, I think I'm down to my last slide or two. Parties and democracy. It's not an overstatement to say parties help make democracy work. I'm just maybe not as in love with them as Lowy is, but they allow for popular participation. They can facilitate effective government. They do provide voting queues. They help us to make electoral decisions. They do organize government when they can pick a leader of the House. And they do provide logistical support for campaigns. Like them or hate them, they are arguably necessary to how our system works today. So we'll talk about parties when we get together next time. Take care. Thanks for your attention. Ciao.